Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Lindamood-Bell for Schools webinar, uh, titled Lindamood-Bell in Your Classroom Begins with a Workshop. My name is Dave Kibra, and I am the Regional Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools. And our For Schools department is the division of Lindamood-Bell that partners with schools, large schools and small schools across the country, to bring Lindamood-Bell programs into the classroom. And so knowing that, Nancy Bell a couple of months ago asked if we could put together a webinar to talk a little bit about what the value of attending the workshops is and what are some of the things that you can take from a workshop and bring back into your classroom. Whether that is a contracted workshop in which Lindamood-Bell is coming to your school or your district to provide a workshop there, or if it's one of the regional workshops that we host around the country. So we're going to talk about all of that good stuff today. So we're going to start off with talking a little bit about why your students may be struggling with reading. And then we'll dive from there into a little bit of a discussion of what process-based education is and why it's so important. And use the idea of process-based education as kind of a fulcrum to jump into discussion about differentiated instruction in a tier 1 setting or in your classroom. And then we'll talk a little bit more again at the end about how to get started. And then I will also answer some questions. I know that there's a Q&A that's going on. So feel free to submit questions. We've got folks who will answer those questions throughout. And then hopefully if we've got some time at the end, I'll be able to answer some questions for the entire group as well. So that's where we're kind of headed to. So I wanted to start the discussion off, as I mentioned, I work in Lindamood-Bell's for Schools division, where I've been for around 15 years. And I spent a good 7 of those years traveling almost every other week to districts across the country and internationally to do workshops. And one of the things that teachers said to me very frequently after workshops is they would come up and they'd say, my teacher prep program, I learned a lot about reading, but I never really learned how to teach reading. And I think that that's probably true. I think that's probably an experience a lot of teachers feel like they have had. And I think that there are some results that come because teachers don't feel like they really know how to teach reading. And one of those is that we end up with a large number of students getting referred to special education who perhaps don't need to be there, but are only going there because they haven't gotten good reading instruction or they haven't gotten the right reading instruction for them yet. And we know that rather than thinking sometimes about a learning disability, we should be thinking about a literacy deficit, especially with regards to those students. And that students with a literacy deficit are often what drives the largest population within schools or within special education. So and we can kind of see that when we think about the breakdowns of which students, which sort of diagnosis students are going into special education with. A lot of them are getting a label of specific learning disability, which frequently is used as sort of a catch-all for students who are really having a difficult time processing language. I think about that when I'm talking to a parent about 2 weeks ago, and she was talking about her third or fourth grade daughter and how she had struggled for years to learn how to read. And ultimately what she got diagnosed with was an anxiety disorder. And so what ended up happening is that obviously the anxiety disorder was caused by the fact that she was having real difficulty learning how to read. And so we ended up recognizing, and she ended up receiving treatment for the symptom rather than the root cause of the issue. And I think that happens for a lot of kids, especially when we think about behavior students and they move into upper elementary and middle school and high school. Kids who've experienced years of frustration and anxiety about their ability to read or to access language tend to act out in a lot of negative ways. And so what ends up happening is we treat the negative behavior rather than treating the underlying cause of that and helping them be able to process language more efficiently and more effectively. So how do we get out of that conundrum? Well, in part, we get out of it by thinking about teaching reading as a process rather than teaching reading as a subject. And teaching reading as a process means that we try to pay attention to and acknowledge that there are some real sensory cognitive functions that underlie students' abilities to learn how to read, right? And we're going to talk a bit about those sensory cognitive functions today and which ones it is that we really strongly address in workshops. And Carl Pribram has a quote that it's kind of a mouthful, but it's good. It says, "We cannot be aware of something not perceived sufficiently at the sensory level to come to consciousness." And I think that that's a great example. I often think about that in a simplified form of saying, at the end of the day, when you're really tired and you sit down to read a book, you read through a page, and at the end of that page, oftentimes you don't remember what it was that you just read, right? And it's not that your eyes didn't go over the words, they certainly did. It's that you weren't actively engaged in creating the images for that language, right? So at the end of it, you didn't have any pictures in your mind, so you couldn't recall what it was that you read. Another person who talked a lot about imagery was Albert Einstein. He said, "If I can't picture it, I can't understand it." And as we go through this webinar, kind of hold on to that idea of Einstein and talking about how picturing language really is the key to being able to understand it. So at Lindamood-Bell, we follow an instructional model that really focuses on driving sensory input, right? We know that processing language is a cognitive act. And since it is a cognitive act, we know that instruction and in language and literacy should be based on a theory of cognition, right? So if decoding words and comprehending oral and written language is a cognitive act, everything that we do then in terms of their instruction should be based on that theory of cognition. And the theory of cognition that we use is, or that underlies the programs, is called the dual coding theory. Dual coding theory was made by a guy named Alan Pavio. He's a researcher who talked about how cognition, or our ability to understand, it's about an interplay between the verbal and the nonverbal systems. Right? That we can understand things to the extent that we can take those words and create images in our mind, right? That's what comprehension is. And obviously that relates to all of academic performance. So if a student is sitting down and they're having trouble decoding the words on a page, that's going to cause them to not create a picture in their mind that matches the content, right? And so they're going to struggle with their cognition. Same thing if I've got a student who maybe can recognize all of the words on a page, but they still can't create images in their mind for those words. That's obviously going to affect their ability to understand what it was that they just read. So that's kind of the nice big theory stuff that underlies our programs. What I wanted to leave you with today was really a good understanding of what it is that happens in a workshop. What are you going to learn in a workshop that you can take back to your classroom? How is this going to impact your ability to work with your students and help them learn how to read? So our goal for all of our students is to get them to a level of independence. Right? And to be an independent reader, you first have to be able to self-correct. And oftentimes in the classroom, because of time constraints or the number of students, most of the teaching happens to sort of assume a level of students being able to self-correct. So if my student's working on a word like, say, slip, for example, and they read it as slap, they've made a mistake, right? Not a huge error, but they've made a mistake. And obviously, if they're reading a passage and they misread the word slip as slap, that's going to impact their ability to create the right images for that passage, which is going to impact their comprehension of it. So a lot of times teachers will say, no, that didn't say slap, go back and read it again. Right? The student goes back and reads it again. Maybe they make a different mistake than they made the first time. And they may do that because in order to self-correct, students first have to be able to monitor for the language that's coming in, right? They have to be able to hold on to what the word is that they said and compare it to what the word should have been, right? And that comes from having good sensory input. Right? Ultimately, it is that sensory input that drives the ability to monitor, which allows you to self-correct, which is what you need in order to be independent. In a sense, specifically, if we're having a student who's reading a word like slip, and they make a mistake and they read it as slap, we want to question down to that sensory input to really drive their phonemic awareness and their symbol imagery. And so I want to give you kind of an example from the Seeing Stars program about how we would drive that sensory input. right? And Seeing Stars is our decoding program. And so if my student looks at the word slip and they read it as slap, I'm going to actually cover over the word so that the student's no longer looking at the word, and I'm going to question them to their imagery and their sensory input. I'm going to start by responding to their response and say to the student, great job. Give them some positive reinforcement. Great job with that SL saying soul at the beginning of that word. When you say slap, what do you picture for your third letter? Right, so I'm questioning down to that sensory input, to their phonemic awareness and symbol imagery, and I'm going to develop their ability to monitor, which, as I said before, is to hold and compare. So when you say slap, what do you picture for your third letter? My student says, ah, oh, that's an A. Great. So now I've gotten them to hold on to that word, and now I can pivot and say, you're absolutely right. If there was an A there, that word would say slap. Now I can uncover the word and say, what do you see for your third letter here? Oh, it's an I. Great, so now I've helped them to compare. And because I developed their ability to hold and compare, I'm then going to allow them to self-correct. Right? Oh, so what should that say? Oh, that's an I, it says slip. And I've taken them through this very deliberate process of going back and questioning to sensory input, helping them hold and compare, allowing them the opportunity to self-correct. And the more I explicitly and deliberately do that, the more my student is going to grow their sensory input and ultimately become independent. So that's how you can think about, something that you can take from the workshop right back into your classroom and begin to use. And that's for decoding. So we've also got our other sort of core program is the visualizing and verbalizing program, and that's our language comprehension and critical thinking program. Same sort of process holds there, right? Because in this case, we want to develop the sensory input of what's called concept imagery, the ability to create pictures in your mind. And there's a great story that comes in the visualizing and verbalizing kit that I like to use a lot, whether I'm teaching a workshop with teachers or I'm working with kids in a classroom. And it's a great story. It's a story about a shark bite. A guy is swimming out in the water. He gets bitten by a very small shark. And he struggles for a little while to get it off. He can't get it off. He gets up to the shore. The shark is still attached to his leg. He hops up to the lifeguards. And finally, with the help of two lifeguards, he yanks the shark loose. So a story that's very high in imagery to try to drive our students' sensory input so that ultimately they can apply that imagery to content material. But a lot of times when I'm doing that story, and I ask teachers or students, for that last sentence, what do those words make you picture? A lot of them will tell me, oh, I'm picturing the man lying on the beach, flailing his arms around. He's got a shark attached to his leg, and the two lifeguards have each got a hold of a fin, and they're yanking the shark off. And I go, oh, that's great. That's really good imagery. But if you all can picture back to that last sentence that I gave the students, it actually doesn't match, right? The last sentence was, with the help of two lifeguards, he finally yanked the shark loose. Again, a small error, but it's not the lifeguards yanking the shark loose. It's actually the guy. And that relates later to some higher order thinking types of activities I might ask that student. So I want to correct that. So I'm going to say to my students, great job with your imagery. I can really picture those men, those lifeguards holding on to the fins and yanking the shark off while the man's arms are flailing. Let's see if that picture matches that last sentence. I can go back and I can now reread the last sentence to them. With the help of two lifeguards, he finally yanked the shark loose. And I can say to my students, does that match our sentence? So I can help them hold on to the image that they created and then compare. So who should we see yanking on the shark? Is it the lifeguards or the man? Oh, it's the man. So they get to compare, and I allow them to self-correct by saying, great. So now tell me what you're picturing for that. What does that look like? Oh, I see the two lifeguards maybe holding his leg, and the man is yanking the shark by the fin. Right? And again, I'm driving that whole process of questioning to sensory input, working them through the process that they need to go through in order to get them to be independent. And that's kind of the steps of handling errors within the program. But actually, these are really embedded into all of the steps of Seeing Stars and visualizing and verbalizing and the rest of our programs, so that we're not just assuming that independence gets developed, but we are very explicitly and consciously driving that process for students. So as you think about reading and as you think about the students that you see there in front of you in the classroom, and you're thinking back to the example that I just gave and where are my students at when they're struggling to read, it's really critical, obviously, to know and understand what the component parts of reading are and how the underlying sensory cognitive functions relate to those parts. So the three sensory cognitive functions that we look to develop at Lindamood-Bell are phonemic awareness, symbol imagery, and concept imagery. And phonemic awareness, I think most of us are probably pretty familiar with at this point. It's that ability to perceive the identity, number, and sequence of sounds within words. So if my students got a word like cat on the page, they can sound it out, at, right? And they can figure out what each of those different sounds is in the word. And they're being successful at phonetically processing it. And that's how a lot of students come to reading initially. But my expectation is that when my student sees that same word in the next paragraph, they should be able to recognize it right away and go, bang, I can see that, that's cat, right? And they're not having to sound it out all over again. Simple imagery is also critical for so much of the language that does not play phonetically fair, right? If I ask my student to spell the word said, as in I said it's time to go, if they're processing it phonetically, they might just say, oh, said, spelled S-E-D, and they're right. That says, phonetically, said. That's not the accurate way that we actually spell that word. Instead, we spell it S-A-I-D, and you have to be able to hold on to and picture that grouping of letters as saying said in your mind. And incidentally, you know, if my student was phonetically processing this word and they were trying to read it on the page, they might notice that that's two vowels next to each other, and they think, oh, that's two vowels go walking, that should say said, right? But it actually doesn't. So phonemic awareness is great to develop initially, but ultimately we need to make sure we're developing symbol imagery for students to become fluent readers, right? And so phonemic awareness and symbol imagery go to seeing stars, which is our decoding program, right? And then concept imagery is that ability to create an image gestalt, so a nice German word for whole from oral or written language. And concept imagery, you know, I think about it as the ability to create a movie in your mind for language as it's coming in, right? We need concept imagery for a single word, for word phrases, sentences, paragraphs, multiple paragraphs. And the program that we use to develop concept imagery is the visualizing and verbalizing program, right? So when we think about what happens as students are reading, we want to be thinking about those three different sensory cognitive functions and how they relate to each other in order to create a student who's a complete reader. So when we think about students beginning to sit down and learn how to read, obviously we're making sure that they can access phonemic awareness so that they can apply that phonemic awareness over to their word attack. They also, though, need to be able to develop, as we mentioned, symbol imagery. Symbol imagery is critical for students' word recognition. Along with that, students, to be fluent readers, have got to have a well-developed vocabulary so that they can use contextual cues, which allows them to read very quickly and fluently. And all of those pieces feed into that overall circle of comprehension, which is the whole point of reading. So when we think about students who are struggling with comprehension, the issue that we want to try to figure out is where exactly are they struggling, right? Are they a student who is struggling with figuring out just how to sound out words and that's why they can't comprehend it? Are they a student who maybe can sound out words but doesn't have good word recognition, so they can't process those words that don't play phonetically fair? Or perhaps they're good at those two decoding tasks, but they don't have a well-developed vocabulary, so they can't use contextual cues to help them read quickly and fluently. And overall, we're always concerned about those three circles because of deficit in any one of those causes a weakness in the whole point of reading, which is comprehension, right? And I think about these Venn diagrams sometimes when I think about how would I handle a student's error or how I handle an error as an independent reader. If I sit down and read a paragraph and maybe there's a typo in it, but I don't catch that typo right away, when I get to the end of the paragraph, what I usually say to myself is, oh, wait a minute, that didn't make sense to me. Right? And so the very first thing I do is to go to that sort of comprehension. That didn't make sense to me. And then I can go back and I can probably figure out what the word was that didn't make sense right away. So I can go back to that language circle and use my vocabulary to correct it. If I need to, I could go all the way back and I could isolate that particular word and take another look at it and figure out how to correct it. And if I had to, I could go all the way back and then sound that word out again. And so there's that sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 process that we go through as an independent reader. And that same process is what we try to develop for folks in the workshops so that they can take that back into their classrooms and work with their students. So when we think about students who are struggling with reading, we know that there is this language processing spectrum that you're working with, right? And if you're a tier 1 or a whole classroom teacher sitting down, you've got 20 kids, you've got 30 kids, within that mix of students, you've got kids who are ranging from a weakness at one end of the language processing spectrum to a weakness at the other. And that you've got all kinds of students who are sprinkled in on this spectrum with varying degrees of weaknesses across them. And you want to try to identify within your classroom where it is that those students are struggling within the reading process so that you can give specific questioning to that exact area, right? And you can do that by going through the same process that we just did, right? So we're coming toward the end, so I wanted to touch again on how process-based education is important and what the role of it is, right? Process-based education is critical because it identifies language processing as the primary goal of the educational experience, right? Think back to Einstein's quote, if I can picture it, I can understand it. That's what we've got to be able to get our students to be able to do. Once they can effectively process language, then children can learn how to read, spell, and comprehend up to their potential. They can access content material. They can sit down and do better on statewide assessments. Ultimately, they can become independent critical thinkers and contribute to society and do all of the things that we want them to be able to do. But having them reread paragraphs or memorize words is not ultimately what's going to get them to that level of being independent. What's going to get them to being independent is to develop their language processing via developing their sensory input. So in terms of next steps that you might think about, we, as I mentioned earlier, host workshops across the country during the summer. So you've got sort of our URL there on the page that you can type in, and you can get to our workshops page. You can also go to our webpage at lblp.com, and you can click on the For Schools section, and that'll take you to the same area. You can always give us a call, talk with one of our instructional experts, try to figure out what workshop is going to work best for you. Tell us a little bit about the students that you're concerned about, what grade level you're teaching at, how it is that you're seeing your students, and we can help figure out how to get you to the right workshop. And I mentioned, seeing stars before, and I mentioned visualizing and verbalizing. We do have some other programs as well. We have the LIPS program, which is focused, if we go back to those reading circles, is really heavily focused in the auditory circle for developing articulatory feedback to help students develop their phonemic awareness. We also have the Talkies program. Talkies is critical or is designed to really develop, as its name implies, talking students. So it's almost a pre-visualizing and verbalizing program. It's for students who are just coming into using vocabulary, whether that, however it is that they are just coming to it. And then we have the On Cloud 9 program. On Cloud 9 is our math program. And On Cloud 9 really focuses on developing both symbol imagery and concept imagery. So symbol imagery for that ability to picture numbers in their mind, and then concept imagery for understanding what it is that students are doing when they're actually doing math. So that's all the stuff I wanted to talk about for today. We did get a couple questions that came through, so let's see if I can pull those up. So the first question that I got is, can I use these programs, can I use these programs with other programs I have to use at my school? Short answer is yes, right? You absolutely can. I think that it's phenomenal if you can go back to your school and you can say, I'm going to carve out time within my day to do the steps of seeing stars or the steps of EV in order to make sure I'm developing those cognitive functions for my students. But ultimately, if you think about visualizing and verbalizing, when would you not want to be asking your students to be picturing for language and helping them develop that concept imagery? You can intermingle that form of questioning into any sort of instruction that it is that you're doing. Same thing with seeing stars. I mean, if we're talking about picturing for letters, that should glide right in with any other form of instruction that you're doing. What might be a little bit different is that hopefully you'll handle students' errors a little bit differently, right? You'll recognize where their weaknesses are, perhaps more efficiently, and you'll be able to handle errors in a more effective manner for them. So hopefully that answers a bit about that one. Next question was, will these programs be helpful only for my struggling learners in small groups, or would it benefit all of my students to work through the steps of the programs? Okay, good question. So I think when we think about benefiting all of our students, we frequently talk about how these programs, and usually when we go into schools, we're focused on developing or implementing seeing stars and visualizing and verbalizing, especially if I'm going into a whole classroom setting. And usually what we'll say is if it's kindergarten through second grade classroom, we're looking for teachers to use seeing stars for 15 minutes and visualizing and verbalizing for 15 minutes with their students. That will help to ensure that cognitive functioning is happening for students, and also help us recognize areas where students may be struggling. And then as you're getting, if you've got struggling readers, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, you can certainly use the program in the classroom, right, and embed those program processes and questions within the classroom. But ultimately, your focus in a tier 1 setting is that content material. And if my students are still struggling with reading, they should be moving to a tier 2, or in all likelihood, a tier 3 setting. And that's where we should be really heavily focusing on the program. But I'd argue visualizing and verbalizing is applicable all the way on through 12th grade, just applied to content material. And I think in terms of our time, that's pretty much it. So I appreciate everybody joining us today. I hope you found this useful. I hope we get a chance to see you at a workshop somewhere across the country today. Again, you've got the registration page there. By all means, feel free to give us a call at any time. We'd love to talk more in depth about these programs with you and make sure that we get you to the right setting that matches your instructional goals. So thanks for joining us, everybody.